August 29th, 2005. It is still dark over southern Louisiana. Not stormy dark, not dramatic dark, just the quiet dark of early morning before the city wakes up. Except this morning, the city will not wake up the way it always has. Because somewhere beneath the dark, the water is already moving. And the walls built to stop it are already starting to fail. Most of New Orleans is either asleep or trying to be. Hurricane Katrina had made landfall just after dawn near Buras, Louisiana. A powerful Category 3 storm. Weaker than the Category 5 monster it had been over the Gulf, but carrying something far more dangerous than wind. Water, not rain, not flooding from the sky. An entire wall of the Gulf of Mexico moving inland. For a brief moment that morning, some officials believed the city had survived. The eye had passed slightly east. Downtown was battered but standing. The French Quarter was wet but intact. The skyline still existed. There was cautious relief in the air. Then the phones started ringing. A breach. Then another. Then another. And by sunrise, New Orleans was no longer fighting a hurricane. It was drowning. And the terrifying part was this. The storm itself had not destroyed the city. The system built to protect it had. What happened next would kill more than 1,400 people, displace hundreds of thousands more, and expose one of the greatest infrastructure failures in modern American history. Because the problem was never the hurricane. The problem was everything that had been ignored for decades before it arrived. To understand how an American city nearly disappeared underwater, you have to start long before Katrina. Long before the hurricane warnings. Long before the evacuation orders. You have to start with the city itself. Because New Orleans should not exist where it does. It sits in southern Louisiana between the Mississippi River to the south and Lake Pontchartrain to the north. Surrounded by wetlands, marshes, and open water on every side. Much of the city lies below sea level. Not slightly below. In some neighborhoods, nearly 10 feet below. That means New Orleans is shaped like a bowl. And when water gets inside a bowl, it does not leave on its own. It stays. The only reason the city functions at all is because of one of the most complicated flood protection systems in the United States. Levees, flood walls, pumping stations, drainage canals, miles and miles of man-made barriers designed to hold back the water pressing against the city from every direction. Take that system away, and New Orleans does not flood. It sinks. People who lived there understood this. It was not abstract. It was daily life. The city had always lived with water as both neighbor and threat. Children grew up hearing stories about hurricanes. Families watched storm seasons the way people elsewhere watched winter. The levees were not background infrastructure. They were survival. And for decades, people trusted them. That trust had a problem. Because engineers had been warning for years that the system was not strong enough. Not for a major storm. Not for the kind of hurricane that everyone knew would eventually come. The levees protecting New Orleans had been built in stages across decades. Many by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Some sections were old. Some were incomplete. Some were built using soil conditions that later turned out to be far weaker than originally believed. And many were never designed for the kind of direct storm surge a major Gulf hurricane could push inland. Studies throughout the 1990s kept reaching the same conclusion. A strong hurricane hitting southeast Louisiana could push enough water into the city to overwhelm the entire system. When researchers modeled the outcome, the results were terrifying. Entire neighborhoods underwater. Mass evacuations. Thousands dead. One scientist later described presenting these findings and feeling like people in the room were treating it like an academic exercise. As if a disaster that large felt too big to be real. As if because it had not happened yet, it somehow would not. In 2004, just 1 year before Katrina, FEMA funded a disaster simulation exercise called Hurricane PAM. It was not a warning for one specific storm. It was a rehearsal for catastrophe. The scenario imagined a slow-moving Category 3 hurricane striking New Orleans directly. The projected outcome was specific and devastating. Over 1 million evacuees. Massive levee failures. Tens of thousands trapped. Disease outbreaks. A humanitarian crisis so large it would require a military-scale federal response. The simulation described exactly what would happen if the system failed. And then almost nothing changed. Funding disputes slowed projects. Political attention moved elsewhere. Reports were filed. Meetings were held. Warnings were acknowledged. But the city remained vulnerable. The problem was never ignorance. The problem was delay. And then, in August 2005, the Atlantic began building something no report could stop. On August 23rd, a tropical depression formed over the southeastern Bahamas. At first, it was ordinary. A weak system. Another name on the storm list. Within 24 hours, it strengthened into Tropical Storm Katrina. It crossed the Bahamas and moved west. On August 25th, Katrina made its first landfall in South Florida as a Category 1 hurricane. Winds around 80 miles per hour. 14 people killed. Serious but survivable. Then it moved into the Gulf of Mexico. And that is where everything changed. The Gulf in late August is warm. Dangerously warm. Surface temperatures near 30 degrees Celsius. For a hurricane, that is fuel. Pure fuel. Warm water feeds rising air. Rising air lowers pressure. Lower pressure strengthens the storm. And above Katrina, upper-level winds were doing exactly what the storm needed. They were pulling heat away efficiently, allowing the system to breathe and intensify almost without resistance. Meteorologists watching the satellite imagery understood immediately. This was bad. Very bad. On August 27th, Katrina reached Category 3. By the following morning, Category 4. Then, overnight, it exploded. By the early hours of August 28th, Katrina became a Category 5 hurricane. Sustained winds of 175 miles per hour. Central pressure collapsing to levels associated with the most violent Atlantic storms ever recorded. From satellite, it looked almost unreal. A perfectly formed eye. Massive spiral bands stretching hundreds of miles across the Gulf. A storm so large, it seemed to own the ocean beneath it. And it was aimed directly at Louisiana. The warnings from the National Hurricane Center became unusually direct. Not technical, not cautious, direct. They warned of catastrophic damage. They warned that the levee system could be overtopped. They warned that entire areas could remain uninhabitable for weeks. One bulletin said that human suffering would be incredible. Meteorologists do not use language like that casually. It meant they believed people would die on a scale that was difficult to describe. The words were on the page. For anyone willing to read them, the outcome was already visible. At 10:00 a.m. on August 28th, New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin issued the order the city had always feared. The first mandatory evacuation in the city's history. He stood before cameras and said what everyone already knew. This was not routine. This was the storm people had been warned about for years. The first choice for every citizen, he said, was to leave. And many did. Highways filled. Gas stations ran dry. Families loaded cars with whatever they could carry. Pets, photographs, medicine, documents. People drove west, north, anywhere away from the coast. More than 1 million people evacuated across the Gulf region. But evacuation is not just a decision. It is transportation. It is money. It is health. It is whether you own a car, whether you can leave your job, whether your grandmother can survive the trip, whether the hospital can move its patients. For tens of thousands of people, especially the elderly, the poor, and the sick, leaving was not simple. Some stayed because they chose to. Some stayed because they had no choice. Public shelters opened. The Louisiana Superdome became the most visible. Thousands arrived carrying bags and blankets and children. They were told it would be safe. It would become one of the most haunting symbols of the entire disaster. Outside, Katrina kept moving north. And though the storm weakened slightly before reaching land, something critical had already happened. People focus on wind categories. Category 5, Category 4, Category 3. But hurricanes do not kill mostly with wind. They kill with surge. Storm surge is the giant mass of ocean water pushed forward by the storm's wind field. It is built during peak intensity. Even as Katrina weakened from Category 5 to Category 3 near shore, the surge had already been created. The water was already moving toward land. A massive wall of the Gulf heading for Louisiana. And once that process begins, there is no stopping it. Only waiting. In New Orleans, the night before landfall felt wrong. Too quiet. Too empty. The city that normally moved with music, traffic, and noise sat in a strange silence. Boarded windows. Dark streets. Police patrols. Families waiting in houses they hoped would hold. People listening to generators. Listening to weather radios. Listening to wind. And somewhere beyond the darkness of the Gulf, Katrina was coming. Not just as a hurricane, as a test of levees built decades ago, of warnings filed and forgotten, of whether a city below sea level could survive the exact disaster everyone knew would happen someday. By sunrise, they would have the answer, and it would be worse than anyone imagined. Before dawn on August 29th, the first serious breach begins at the Industrial Canal. This waterway, officially called the Inner Harbor Navigation Canal, cuts through the eastern side of New Orleans like an open wound. For years, engineers had warned about it. It connected the Mississippi River to Lake Pontchartrain, and more dangerously, to the Mississippi River Gulf outlet, a shipping channel that experts believed acted like a funnel during hurricanes, driving storm surge directly toward the heart of the city. Locals had another name for it: the Hurricane Highway. When Katrina's surge arrived, that warning became reality. Water pushed through the Gulf outlet and slammed into the canal system with enormous force. At approximately 5:00 a.m., a floodwall section gave way. Then another. A 30-foot breach opened. Then widened. Then kept widening. Water rushed through with the force of a river at full flood. It did not creep. It attacked. Entire neighborhoods in the lower Ninth Ward began filling within minutes. Residents who had stayed behind described hearing a sound like a freight train. Not wind, water. Walls of dark water moving through streets faster than people could run. People woke up inside homes already flooding. Bedrooms became pools. Furniture floated. Children were lifted onto kitchen counters. People climbed to attics. That detail would later become one of the most haunting symbols of Katrina. The attics. Because when floodwater rises fast enough, the attic becomes the last place to go. But attics are traps. No doors. Only ceilings. Only the roof above. Later, rescue teams would find axe marks cut through rooftops across entire neighborhoods. People had hacked their way upward to survive. Some made it onto roofs. Some never got out. As water poured into the lower Ninth Ward, another disaster was beginning elsewhere. At the 17th Street Canal, one of the main drainage canals separating New Orleans from Jefferson Parish, the pressure was building against a concrete floodwall system that should have held. It didn't. At around 9:00 a.m., the wall failed. A massive breach opened. Water from Lake Pontchartrain rushed directly into Lakeview, one of the city's major residential neighborhoods. Then London Avenue Canal failed too. Another breach. Another neighborhood gone. This was the moment everything changed. Not because Katrina had hit. Because the city's protection system had collapsed from multiple directions at once. New Orleans was no longer dealing with storm damage. It was dealing with urban submersion. By the afternoon of August 29th, 20% of the city was underwater. Within 48 hours, that number would rise to nearly 80%. Some neighborhoods sat under 15 feet of water. Entire blocks disappeared beneath the surface. Cars floated into houses. Boats drifted down residential streets. Traffic lights stuck out of brown water like warnings that arrived too late. The most brutal part was who got hit hardest. The French Quarter survived relatively well. It sits on slightly higher ground. The Garden District too. Historic, elevated, less vulnerable. But the lower Ninth Ward, New Orleans East, Gentilly, St. Bernard Parish, Lakeview. Working neighborhoods. Family neighborhoods. Places where people had fewer options. Those places took the full force. This mattered because disasters are never evenly distributed. Water follows gravity, and poverty often lives at the lowest point. Leila Borde was 52 years old. She lived in the lower Ninth Ward in the same house where she had grown up. When the floodwall broke, the water entered her street within minutes. By the time she reached her attic, the water was already at her chest. She broke through the roof with her bare hands. She sat on the shingles for 2 days. No food, no rescue. Watching waterlogged furniture float past the place where her front yard used to be. She was eventually pulled off by a Coast Guard helicopter on the morning of August 31st. When she returned months later, the house was gone. Only the concrete steps remained. The steps she had climbed every day of her childhood. Standing alone in an empty lot. She took a photograph there. Not because it was useful. Because memory needs a place to stand. At the Superdome, roughly 15,000 people had arrived before the storm made landfall. What followed was a humanitarian crisis that unfolded on live television in front of the entire country. Food ran out. Water ran out. Toilets stopped working. The roof of the Superdome was partially torn open by the wind. People were sleeping on concrete floors in 95-degree August heat. Medical emergencies multiplied. The smell became unbearable by the second day. The building was never meant to function as a long-term survival center. It was shelter, temporary shelter. But as roads disappeared beneath floodwater and the city submerged, temporary became indefinite. Days passed before buses arrived to move people out. Outside, the city had become something different, something the country had never seen inside its own borders. An American city, underwater, and the people inside it waiting. At the convention center, conditions became worse. Thousands gathered there expecting buses that had not come. No formal food distribution. Almost no water. No medical structure. Days passed. The images that came out of New Orleans in those days shocked the country. People on rooftops waving white towels at passing helicopters. Elderly residents in wheelchairs on highway overpasses surrounded by water. Families with children stranded on overpasses in August heat for 3 and 4 days. Strangers holding infants. People making signs out of anything they could find. The defining image of Katrina was not the storm. It was people waiting. Waiting on rooftops. Waiting on bridges. Waiting outside shelters. Waiting for government systems that had promised protection. Gerald Anderson was 71 years old. He had refused to evacuate because he had survived Hurricane Betsy in 1965 and every storm since. He knew his house. He knew his neighborhood. He did not know the levees would fail. When the water entered his home, it rose 3 feet in under 10 minutes. He made it to his second floor. Then the water kept rising. He broke open an attic hatch. He stayed there for 51 hours. No food. A small bottle of water he had grabbed on the way up. When he was finally found by a neighbor in a borrowed boat, he had lost 20 pounds. He never moved back. He died in Baton Rouge 4 years later. His daughter said he talked about that attic every single day. The federal response quickly became one of the most controversial aspects of the disaster. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, had modeled this exact scenario before. They knew levee failure was possible. They knew mass shelter failures were possible. They knew the city was vulnerable. And yet, when Katrina hit, the response looked chaotic. Slow, confused, disconnected. Local officials blamed state officials. State officials blamed federal agencies. Federal agencies blamed communication breakdowns. Meanwhile, people were still trapped in houses. Water was still rising in neighborhoods with no rescue in sight. And television was broadcasting all of it. Live. Across flooded neighborhoods, people found whatever ways they could to signal for help. Spray-painted messages on rooftops. Bedsheets hung from second-story windows. Flashlights waved at helicopters. Some called relatives in other states, who then called television stations because emergency lines were overwhelmed. People trapped inside homes described hearing rescue boats pass nearby and screaming until their voices gave out. Some were rescued by professionals. Many were rescued by ordinary people. Neighbors in fishing boats. Strangers in aluminum john boats. Men using air mattresses as flotation devices. The unofficial rescue fleet, later known as the Cajun Navy, began before it had a name. People with boats drove toward the disaster because waiting for formal systems felt like waiting too long. Within 48 hours, ordinary people in flat-bottomed boats had rescued thousands, pulling families from second-story windows, pulling children from rooftops, pulling elderly residents who had survived the flood but could not survive much more waiting. The government had failed them. Strangers had not. Nearly 40% of all fatalities were caused by drowning. Almost half of the dead were over the age of 74. That statistic matters because it shows exactly who disasters choose first. Not randomly. The people with the fewest ways out. The people with the least. The people who had already been hardest to evacuate were now the people hardest to rescue. Dorothea Chason was 83 years old. She lived in St. Bernard Parish. Her family had evacuated, but she had refused to leave. She had lived in that house for 41 years. She survived the storm itself on her second floor. When rescuers reached her neighborhood on September 1st, 3 days after landfall, they found Dorothea in her attic. She had been there for 60 hours. Without water. In August heat that reached over 100 degrees inside that sealed space. She survived. She was airlifted to a hospital in Baton Rouge. She never went home. The house was demolished 6 months later. By August 31st, aerial footage over New Orleans showed images that looked impossible inside the United States. An American city underwater. People stranded on rooftops waving towels. Military vehicles driving through residential streets. Boats navigating intersections. The scale forced comparisons that made people uncomfortable. Because this was not supposed to happen here. Not in the wealthiest country in the world. Not in a major American city. Not after years of warnings. But it was happening. And the cameras were rolling. And the country was watching. And the question that kept being asked in living rooms across America was the same. How did this happen? The answer was not comfortable. Because the answer was not Katrina. The answer was everything before Katrina. Engineering investigations launched in the weeks and months after the storm would reach a conclusion that changed everything. The American Society of Civil Engineers conducted one of the most thorough structural analyses in the history of American infrastructure. Their findings were direct. 2/3 of the flooding of New Orleans could have been avoided if the levees had held. 2/3. Not all, but enough to change history. Enough to mean entire neighborhoods would have survived. Enough to mean families who drowned might still be alive. The levees had not simply been overtopped by an unimaginable storm. Many sections had failed at water levels below what they were designed to withstand. Some floodwalls had collapsed due to flawed design assumptions made decades earlier. Some had failed due to poor soil analysis that had never been corrected. Some had incomplete construction that left fatal weaknesses hidden beneath the surface where no one thought to look. The disaster was not only natural, it was structural. And structural means man-made, which meant someone had to ask the question, who knew? And the answer was everyone. They had known. The simulations had existed. The reports had existed. The warnings had existed. And still, when the water came, it found exactly the weaknesses that engineers had already identified. That realization would define Katrina long after the floodwater was gone. Because people can forgive weather. They struggle to forgive negligence. In June 2006, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers formally acknowledged what independent investigators had already concluded. Faulty design specifications, incomplete sections, and construction failures had contributed directly to the flooding of New Orleans. It was an official admission of something that survivors already believed. This was not just bad luck. It was preventable. And that admission changed the story permanently. Because when a storm destroys you, people mourn. When a preventable failure destroys you, people ask who should have known better. And when the answer is everyone, the anger has nowhere clean to go. The official death toll from Hurricane Katrina, revised by the National Hurricane Center in 2023, stands at approximately 1,400 people. In Louisiana alone, more than 1,500 lives were lost. Over 134,000 housing units in New Orleans sustained damage. That represents 70% of all occupied homes in the city. 1 million housing units across the broader Gulf Coast region were affected. The population of New Orleans fell from nearly 485,000 people before the storm to an estimated 230,000 by the following year. More than half the city gone. Displaced to Houston, to Atlanta, to Baton Rouge, to cities across America that suddenly held entire New Orleans communities living in hotel rooms and relatives, spare bedrooms and FEMA trailers. For many families, evacuation became permanent. Children changed schools in states they never planned to live in. Grandparents died without returning home. Neighborhoods that had held generations of families simply stopped existing. Some neighborhoods rebuilt. Some barely rebuilt at all. The lower Ninth Ward, one of the hardest hit areas, remained visibly scarred for years. Empty lots where houses once stood. Streets that were repaved but never repopulated. The uneven recovery became part of Katrina's legacy. New Orleans survived, but not equally. The federal government eventually committed more than $14 billion to rebuilding and reinforcing the levee system around New Orleans. New floodgates, massive surge barriers, improved pumping stations, a stronger perimeter defense designed for storms stronger than Katrina. The hurricane and storm damage risk reduction system that exists today is substantially more robust than the one that failed in 2005. Engineers describe it as one of the largest civil infrastructure rebuilds in modern American history. But ask many residents whether they feel fully safe now. The answer is often hesitation. Because trust, once flooded, is harder to rebuild than concrete. Every hurricane season brings the question back. And every August, New Orleans listens differently than cities that have never been where it has been. Katrina's name was retired by the World Meteorological Organization in April 2006. It will never be used again for an Atlantic storm. That happens only when a hurricane becomes too associated with death and destruction. Some names stop being weather. They become history. Katrina became one of those names. A name no longer placed on storm lists because saying it already means something. It means memory. It means warning. It means proof. 20 years later, New Orleans is still New Orleans. Music still spills onto Frenchman Street on Saturday nights. The food is still unlike anything else in America. The city rebuilt, but it rebuilt unevenly. And in the neighborhoods that bore the worst of the flooding, the question of whether the recovery was ever truly complete has never fully gone away. Because some scars are visible in empty lots and raised foundations and rebuilt flood walls. And some scars only exist in the people who still measure time as before Katrina and after Katrina. Because for them, that storm was not weather. It was a dividing line in a life. There are disasters that destroy buildings. And there are disasters that permanently alter trust. Katrina did both. It drowned streets. It drowned assumptions. It exposed what had been quietly fragile for decades beneath the surface of a city built on borrowed time. The storm did not create the inequality. It revealed it. It did not invent the government failure. It televised it. It did not make New Orleans vulnerable. It proved how vulnerable it had always been. Because New Orleans was never protected by levees alone. It was protected by attention, by maintenance, by political will, by believing that prevention matters even when disaster feels far away. And when that attention disappeared, quietly, over years, the levees held the shape of safety without holding the substance of it. Until one morning in August when the phones started ringing. And the water came through. And everything the warnings had promised would happen, happened. The storm did not destroy New Orleans. The system did. And for the 1,400 people who did not survive, that difference is not a footnote. It is everything. Every storm eventually ends. But the way we hold each other through the darkness, that remains. Take care of one another. If you made it this far, these stories take serious time and care to bring together. If this video meant something to you, a like and a subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories the way they deserve to be told. Stay alert. I'll see you in the next one.